Laura Weber is an independent scholar and a lifelong resident of Minneapolis. From 2016 to 2021, she served as editor of Minnesota History, the quarterly of the Minnesota Historical Society. She's the author of some 30 articles on Minnesota Jewish history in Minnepedia, an online encyclopedia of Minnesota history. Recent publications include Minneapolis, the Curious Twin A Reexamination, Middle West Review, Spring 2022, and Jews and the Civil Rights Movement in the American West, a round table from Western State Jewish History, Spring 2021, where she wrote about the Minnesota experience. She is also the author of Gentiles Preferred, Minneapolis Jews and Employment, 1920 to 1950, which is in Minnesota History in the spring of 1991, which won the Solon J. Buck Award for the best article of the year in the quarterly. Laura is a member of the advisory board of the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives at the University of Minnesota Libraries. So please welcome our speaker, Laura.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Kate, whether you're here in person or on Zoom. I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, and its director, Steve Hunnigs, and the other co-sponsor, the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Minnesota, and director Natan Paradise. I'd also like to thank the fantastic communication team at the University of Minnesota Libraries, Kate Carmody McIntosh, Mike Sutliff, and Mark Engebretson, and especially Kate Dietrich, the archivist, as she just told you, of the Nathan and Teresa Berman Upper Midwest Jewish Archives, which is the sponsor of this talk. Mike. There. Okay. So there it is. The quote. I won't read it. I'll let you read it if you haven't heard it already. In the 75 years since the publication of Carey McWilliams' article, Minneapolis, the Curious Twin, the notion of Minneapolis as the capital of mid-20th century American anti-Semitism has achieved meme status. From major overviews to History Day papers, it is hard to find a single account of Minnesota Jewish history, including some by me, that does not note the shocking and quote-worthy appellation penned by McWilliams. Minneapolis was indeed fertile ground for a variety of anti-Semitic activity in the decades before and after the 1946 publication of Curious Twin in the magazine Common Ground. The article provided a measure of comfort to Minneapolis Jewry for illuminating its troublesome situation. More importantly, it moved elected officials to action, whether out of genuine concern, political posturing, or perhaps a bit of both. Proving or disproving a thesis or a subjective claim, like whether one city or another was the capital of anti-Semitism in the mid-20th century, is beyond the scope of my article or this talk. Yet, as repetition of this phrase, shorthand for a complex situation, shows no sign of dissipating, I became curious to know more about the Curious Twin. What was the article's genesis? Who was the author? What was its contemporary reception? Just as Carey McWilliams, here he is, aimed to demythologize the character and culture of California in his influential writings on his adopted state, my essay similarly aims to demythologize McWilliams's characterization of Minneapolis as the US capital of anti-Semitism. You'll get to see him more in a minute. I just wanted to talk a bit about how this article came about. I just read to you the opening paragraph of the article, and as Kate said, it came out about a year ago in the journal Middle West Review, which is published for the Midwestern History Association by the University of Nebraska Press. Just as I'm, well, in 2019, I saw a call for proposals on Twitter historians for an upcoming symposium on the Jewish Midwest in this publication, which I already was familiar with. But I remember thinking, I have got to be a part of this. But what am I going to write about? I wasn't at the time like working actively on something. Around this time, my friend and mentor, Marilyn Chiat, who is here in the middle of the room, handed me a printout of an oral history interview done in the late 1960s with Rabbi David Aronson, who from 1924 to 1948 was the spiritual leader of Bethel Synagogue, then in North Minneapolis, today in St. Louis Park. In the oral history interview, he stated that an article appeared in one of the national magazines charging Minneapolis as being the capital of anti-Semitism. At the time, I remember the National B'nai B'rith magazine asked me to write a comment, and I wrote an article on this. And I concluded, this is Aronson, that it wasn't conscious anti-Semitism, it was just a lack of communication. That the discrimination was not just against the Jews, but against all those that did not belong to the inner circle. I'd also like to mention there's a vitrine over there by the wall that has copy of the article and some of the other documents that I'm going to mention. So not only did Marilyn give me this printout, she also had already found the reference to the article that Aronson wrote. Needless to say, I was thrilled that the University of Minnesota Libraries maintains bound volumes of the National Jewish Monthly from 1947. Aronson's article was something of a rebuttal or perhaps a modifier. So I thought, even at the time, so his thesis was not accepted unquestioningly even then. It seemed the meme was due for a close look, something others that who are familiar with this topic, including Kate and Linda Schloff, who's here too, agreed with. So there's been an excellent biography of Carey McWilliams that came out called American Prophet, which I will be referring to frequently. And Richardson used the term demythologize to describe what McWilliams did with his writing on the American West, and something that McWilliams also had done in his first book that he published when he was only 20 on the journalist Ambrose Bierce. So I thought, hey, there's what I can say I'm doing. I'm going to demythologize this article. So let me emphasize here that I was not and am not trying to refute the fact that Minneapolis was indeed a hotbed of anti-Semitism in the mid-20th century. Okay, everybody got that? I am not doing that. All right, so here's what we're gonna talk about. So when Carey McWilliams called Minneapolis the Curious Twin, of course, he was referring to the nickname Minneapolis and St. Paul as the Twin Cities. Many historians and contemporary observers have noted that Minneapolis and St. Paul were different when it came to attitudes toward their Jewish citizens. In both St. Paul and Minneapolis, the first Jews to arrive were small numbers of German-speaking Jews, or people, sorry, who migrated from the eastern and southern United States after originally immigrating from Central Europe. Here's St. Paul, just some random shots. So in both cities, the German Jews were followed beginning in the 1880s by a much larger wave of Yiddish-speaking, more religiously observant Eastern European Jews who were pushed to emigrate by poverty, pogroms, and prejudice. A crucial difference between the two cities is that the German Jews in St. Paul arrived 20 years earlier than they had arrived in Minneapolis. Here's some scenes of early poverty-stricken North Minneapolis, a tenement on, I think, 6th and Lyndale, and a junkyard. So the Jews of St. Paul established the first synagogue, Mount Zion Temple, which is on the left here, in 1856, which is 2 years before Minnesota statehood. This is a view from the synagogue from later years. Minneapolis didn't establish its first synagogue for 20 years till 1878, and that first synagogue is today's Temple Israel. So another context figure, the entire Jewish population of Minnesota in 1880 was 1,000. In both cities, Jews established shops selling ready-made clothing and dry goods. But in St. Paul, they arrived alongside the other white settlers from the eastern United States, including a significant population of Germans with whom the Jewish merchants shared many cultural traits. Historian Mary Lethert Wingard noted that these St. Paul Jewish merchants were able to provide capital needed to fuel the territorial economy. This was in marked contrast to Minneapolis, where the commercially self-sufficient Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite funded and controlled both the primary industries, which of course were lumber and flour milling, and the social mores of the city. So as a result, employment opportunities for Minneapolis Jews in those industries, as well as most others, were closed. By the 1920s, for the most part, Minneapolis Jews had to be self-employed, either as proprietors of their own businesses or as professionals. The situation was by no means confined to Minneapolis or Minnesota. One source I found in the American Jewish World indicated that by the end of the 1920s, Jews were excluded from 90% of the general office jobs in New York City. Throughout the 1930s, the Twin Cities-based newspaper, the American Jewish World, published reports of employment and education discrimination in other cities, including Detroit, Chicago, and Philadelphia. And I found all that stuff when I was a very young person doing my master's research here at the U of M. A locally penned column noted in 1932 noted, however, that Minneapolis-St. Paul was actually a paradise in comparison to eastern cities when it came to employment. Whether this observation by executive secretary of the Minneapolis Jewish Family Welfare Association was defensive or definitive cannot be determined. Similar exclusion was experienced by Jews west of the Mississippi, Los Angeles, Denver, and Portland, where residents recalled signs downtown that read, "We don't serve Negroes, Jews, and dogs." Social discrimination flourished in Arizona at resorts like the Camelback Inn. And I just bring this up to say, I think you can figure out what I'm saying here. This is a few statistics about, again, Minneapolis and its Jewish population. You can see, actually in 1930, Jews made up 3.5% of Minneapolis, which is a pretty high percentage. It's higher than, that is higher maybe than it was ever been. Okay, yeah. And the whole state, 30,000. So close to half, actually more than half of the Jews in Minnesota lived in Minneapolis in 1930. So the population, this is more North Minneapolis scenes. That cute little boy is standing in front of the Sumner Field housing projects that had just been built in the late 1930s and housed, I think 1/4 of the residents were Jewish residents. And one of my mother's friends lived there, and she said it was fantastic that they could move into these projects. They were really great compared to the housing that she was living in. Okay, so McWilliams emphasized in his article that he observed instances here of civic and social discrimination. It's indeed true that the end of World War I marked the beginning of almost total exclusion of Jews from participation in civic and social organizations in certain parts of Minnesota, as well as restrictions in housing and resort accommodations. These conditions continued unabated throughout the 1930s and in the post-war years. The rise of fascism in Italy and Germany in the 20s and 30s emboldened thousands of Hitler's American friends. This is the phrase that historian Bradley Hart uses. They openly proclaimed opposition to the US entering the war in Europe and conspiracy theories about Jewish control of and influence over the US government. So how many have watched Ken Burns' America and the Holocaust? You saw this, right? Okay. One of the groups the hate groups was the Silver Legion of America, better known as the Silver Shirts. They caused a sensation locally when in 1936, the Minneapolis Journal published a 6-part investigation into its activities written by, his name then was Arnold Severide. We came to know him better as Eric Severide, CBS journalist. Among its revelations was the fact that silver shirt meetings were attended by some of Minneapolis's leading citizens, including Dr. George Drake, a member of the Minneapolis School Board, as well as George K. Belden, head of Associated Industries of Minneapolis, an anti-union employers group. So there's Belden looking guilty on the right. For those who know anything about Minneapolis history, the 1934 Teamsters strike was conducted against a group called the Citizens Alliance. So they had, when they lost that strike, they changed the name to the Associated Industries. So in spite of the bad publicity in 1936, 2 years later, a silver shirt organizer named Roy Zachary on the left returned to the area. Meetings were held in both Minneapolis and St. Paul. Anti-Semitic innuendo was also a factor behind the defeat of 1938 incumbent farmer labor governor Elmer Benson, who, like his predecessor Floyd B. Olson, was not Jewish, but had Jewish advisors and cabinet members. So that donkey is Benson. He's being ridden by 3 of his Jewish advisors, and those beseeching hands, the labels, it's really hard to read, but they're all these different ethnic groups that are help us, save us from the Jewish influence. Finally, the fundamentalist and evangelical Christian character of the silver shirts may have been a source of its appeal to certain citizens of Minneapolis, which was the home to the headquarters of the World Fundamentalist Movement and Northwestern Bible College, which is still out there, right? Northwestern College. Leading Protestant clergymen, preached anti-Semitic sermons from Minneapolis pulpits and radio stations, local analogs to the nationally syndicated broadcasts of the Catholic priest Charles Coughlin, there's some stuff about him in the vitrine. These clergymen included William Bell Riley on the left, spiritual leader of Minneapolis's most prominent churches, First Baptist. He also was the co-founder of the Northwest Bible School, and he was succeeded by, who knows? Not you, Billy Graham. And the evangelist Luke Rader of the River Lake Gospel Tabernacle was another one. And so many of us have enjoyed meals at the Longfellow Cafe, right? That's the River Lake. That's where the River Lake was there. Okay, this in brief was the environment for Minneapolis Jews in the fall of 1946, when Curious Twin appeared in the quarterly magazine Common Ground. The author, Carey McWilliams, was a lawyer, activist, journalist, and former California state official known for championing the rights of ethnic, religious, and racial minorities. So, who was Carey McWilliams? To answer this question, I relied on his 1978 memoir, The Education of Carey McWilliams, and the Richardson biography I mentioned that came out in 2005, American Prophet, The Life and Work of Carey McWilliams. Becoming familiar with McWilliams was an unexpected highlight of this project. He is really a figure to know about. You might have to stop me from talking too much about him. I will refrain. Richardson acknowledges that McWilliams is unknown to readers today, not to mention the culture at large, and that this pretty much universal unfamiliarity makes it difficult to assess his legacy. And the other thing he says is that most people born before 1960 have never heard of him. But Richardson makes the case, I think very persuasively, that Richard McWilliams was one of the most versatile, productive, and consequential American public intellectuals of the 20th century, citing his focus on racial and ethnic inequality, immigration and border security, environmental degradation, and civil liberties. So he was writing about this stuff in the 30s, 40s, and on. But there is little in his biography, his early biography, to indicate that he would later become a forceful advocate for civil rights. On his father's side, he was of old school Protestant stock. His mother's parents were first and second generation German and French Canadian Catholics. In 1922, his mother and his brother moved from his birthplace in Colorado to California. His father had died the previous year following the failure of the family's Colorado cattle ranch. McWilliams was not yet out of high school. So his early ambitions were literary. He loved H.L. Mencken and F. Scott Fitzgerald. And he was a carouser, leading to his being expelled from one college and suspended from another. He eventually earned a law degree from the University of Southern California in 1927 and obtained a position at a prestigious Los Angeles firm, which he maintained through 1939. Concurrent with his day job as an attorney, McWilliams associated with a group of writers that included Louis Adamich, later the founder and first editor of Common Ground, and Upton Sinclair. He made a contact of his idol Mencken, who published some of McWilliams's early journalism. Throughout the 1920s, McWilliams's writings reflected Mencken's irreverence, iconoclasm, and low regard for American politics. And if you know anything about H.L. Mencken, I don't think he was a very nice person. He was an anti-Semite and a bigot. Okay, and it was very well known. McWilliams at the time knew few, if any, ethnic minorities, though several were defendants in cases he worked on at the law firm, including a group of striking Mexican citrus workers. Biographer Richardson reveals blithe references to, pardon the expression, chinks and damned Mexicans in his journals from the 1920s, as well as two hateful anti-Jewish screeds, one of which was written after an argument over a bill with a Jewish druggist in 1923. And this is what he wrote: "Say what you will, there is something filthy, rotten, and wholly despicable in the Jewish character." McWilliams never, this is a quote from Richardson, never acknowledged publicly his early intolerance nor suggested his source. And further, when read against McWilliams' subsequent work on prejudice and discrimination, this intolerance raises important questions about the evolution of his views on race, ethnicity, and prejudice. Richardson posits that McWilliams' racist and undemocratic edges may be reflective of white male Protestant privilege and his family history and models. So what changed? He was radicalized by the effects of the Great Depression and the rise of fascism in Europe, as well as domestically. He allied with left-wing political and judicial and legal organizations, including the American Civil Liberties Union and the National Lawyers Guild, which was a more liberal version of whatever the main lawyers are. Yeah. He represented workers in and around Los Angeles and helped organize unions and guilds, all while writing for The Nation and other progressive magazines. So remember, he's working full-time as a lawyer. He's representing a lot of ethnic minorities, plus he's working as a freelance journalist. His concerns with what he called domestic fascism led to his concern with religious and ethnic prejudice. So what did he mean by domestic fascism? He called it things like union busting, anti-Semitism, nativism, militarism, capitalist exploitation, and lynching, red baiting, vigilante justice. All the bad things that were happening, he referred to as domestic fascism. He wrote a 1935 pamphlet called "It Can Happen Here," which reference to Sinclair Lewis, active anti-Semitism in Los Angeles. That his concern was primarily with fascism rather than anti-Semitism as such was corroborated by an article he wrote that year for a new magazine called Pacific Weekly. Entitled "Jewish Fascism," McWilliams's piece stridently condemned the elder statesmen of the race who cowardly used anti-Nazi sentiment to fortify the capitalist status quo. So I had to figure out what's going on here. On one hand, you know, he's concerned with anti-Semitism. On the other hand, he's accusing Jews in the 30s of being also capable of fascism because they were capitalists and that they used, the anti-Nazi sentiment to fortify the status quo that he claimed they were really attached to. There was more. It's in my article. You can read. It gets better. So the success of McWilliams' third book, 1939's Factories in the Field, which was a look at the lives of migrant farm workers in California, meant he could cease full-time work as an attorney and devote all his time to writing, lecturing, and advocacy. It didn't hurt that Factories in the Field came out the same year as John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. Steinbeck's account of the same milieu both became bestsellers. Shortly before the publication of Factories in the Field, California Governor Culbert Olson offered McWilliams leadership of California's Division of Immigration and Housing, an office he held until 1942. Public service tempered the bombastic tone McWilliams had taken in his journalism of the 1930s. His preoccupation with domestic fascism similarly abated. During the 1940s, McWilliams was a writing and lecturing machine, publishing some 100 articles between 1942 and 1948 alone. He also published 4 books about prejudice faced by minority groups, including African Americans, Japanese Americans, Jews, and Mexican Americans. So here we get to the article. How did it come about? In 1945, January, Carey McWilliams became the West Coast contributing editor for The Nation. The magazine sent him on nationwide lecture tours twice a year, which brought him to the Midwest multiple times. His observations on the patterns of anti-Semitism during these tours led to Minneapolis, The Curious Twin, published in the fall of 1946 in the journal Common Ground. It was a fairly short article, about 5 pages long. So Common Ground existed for 9 years between 1940 and 1949. It was published by the Common Council for American Unity, with funding from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Like The Nation, Common Ground was a leftist magazine identified with the wartime movement for ethno-racial democracy. Subscriptions peaked at just under 9,000 in 1946, which was the year this article came out. When I returned to The Curious Twin for this project, after probably not looking at it for decades, I was struck by the fact that beyond the oft-quoted bombshell, the tone of the article is somewhat passive and equivocating. Later, I read biographer Richardson describing other writing by McWilliams like this, that these are quotes again from my favorite Richardson, but he describes Carey McWilliams' writing as occasional stretches of limited evidence to fit desired conclusions, or occasionally stretches limited evidence to fit desired conclusions. He notes his artful use of the passive voice, and twice notes within the text of some other article, this is Carey noting the absence of reliable facts, but nevertheless advances his claim, qualifying it heavily as he fortifies it with the modifier. You writers, I know there's a lot of you in here. Curious Twin backs into its subject via a number of qualifications. Considering that these qualifications preface the phrase, they deserve quoting in full. McWilliams began by notifying that he collects sociological questions during lecture trips. Then he continues, and here you can see what he writes next. And I have helpfully highlighted in yellow what I consider to be some of these qualifications, and I will kind of let you look it over so you don't have to hear my voice for another second here. Yeah. Okay, so admittedly superficial impressions, the fresh curiosity of the uninitiated overnight visitor may compensate to some extent for the lack of specific information and data. Okay, this is how it starts. All right. He wants to stimulate a real answer from those who have the full facts. So here we are 75 years later. All right. Then he goes on to say, while the contrast is not of the black and white variety, the pattern of anti-Semitism is much more pronounced in Minneapolis than St. Paul. Then the oft quoted lines followed by, in almost every walk of life, an iron curtain separates Jews from non-Jews in Minneapolis. Nor is this iron curtain a matter of recent origin. On the contrary, it seems to have always existed. Next, he said, so far as I know, Minneapolis is the only city in America in which Jews are, as a matter of practice and custom, ineligible for membership in the service clubs, the Kiwanis, the Rotary, Lions, etc. Even the Automobile Club in Minneapolis refuses to accept Jews as members, but this isn't the case in St. Paul. And so what I'll mention here is that at the time, the AAA had a golf club and a country club. I'm looking at Linda in Maryland, and that is the reason. I mean, not the reason, but it wasn't like they said, we don't want to have the tow truck come and pick up your car if you're Jewish. He then says that the most striking aspect of anti-Semitism in Minneapolis is the lack of significant Jewish participation in the dominant activities of the city: milling, lumbering, transportation, private utilities, etc. And even to a degree, and this is all true, department stores, which in every other city almost in the US, including St. Paul, the main department stores had been established by German Jews. Then he describes the Jewish community as highly introverted, bound up in a maze of purely Jewish activities, a depressed element in the population, one that by comparison with other urban Jewish communities of comparable size shows evidence of social retardation. These are among the phrases that Rabbi Aronson, in the article that Marilyn hit me to, would later take issue with. McWilliams tells the reader that on one of his visits to Minneapolis, he ran his He ran his observations by some longtime locals, including a rabbi, labor leaders, an extremely intelligent Jewish lawyer, his words, prominent civic leaders, a newspaper publisher, and some Negro residents. He puts the most stock in the perspective of the Jewish lawyer, who noted that a few intertwined families among the early arriving Protestant Anglo-Saxons got a hold on and monopolized the city's major industries, which is true. I mean, it's not like the article is a complete fabrication. They were later followed by the Scandinavians who occupied the middle social rung. The Scandinavian Lutheran element, which he stated made up 1/3 of the Minneapolis population, and then he writes, without being able to verify the fact, contrasted with St. Paul, where the Jewish community existed, as I mentioned, 25 years before Minneapolis, and whose predominant ethnic groups were the less uptight German and Irish Catholics. That's a phrase he used in his 1978 memoir. And that the Minneapolis's pulpit thumping fundamentalists and other anti-Semitic rabble rousers appealed to the lower social status levels. So McWilliams really, he used this theory on a lot of occasions, but he said the upper class used social, economic, and political anti-Semitism to preserve their status. Their attitude was then copied by the classes below them. Therefore, the attitude towards Jews, he said, is not an ethnocentric group judgment or even a judgment on individual behavior, but rather the status structure of the community itself. The article concludes with McWilliams stepping back and suggesting that others conduct a close study of what he has revealed. Only a visiting lecturer would be foolhardy enough to anticipate conclusions of such a study, but he's definitely willing to venture a few anticipations. He then repeats his theory of the social nature of group antagonisms, and then the article ends somewhat anticlimactically with abstract musings and citations from a social scientist and psychiatrist on the nature of prejudice. When Curious Twin came out in the fall of 1946, McWilliams was one of America's most productive, versatile, and consequential writers, according to biographer Richardson. In addition, he lectured extensively, testified regularly and forcefully, and was an effective debater, both in person and over the airwaves. Though still a few years away from his influential tenure at the Nation, he was unmistakably a voice to be reckoned with. Reaction to Minneapolis, the Curious Twin, was swift. On October 18th, 1946, the Minneapolis Star-Journal published a condensed version of McWilliams' article on its editorial page, and that article is in there. And they started by saying, you know, the Star undertakes to keep its readers aware of what is being said elsewhere in the nation, in the city and state. Usually such comment is praise and is read with pride and satisfaction. But today we include the bitter with the sweet. So then we have enter David Aronson, the spiritual leader of Bethel Synagogue, who I mentioned at the outset. So he responded to the Curious Twin on the front page of the October 25th. I'm giving these little dates because remember the article came out on the 18th, and then, you know, a few days later, he published his response in the local Jewish newspaper. And that's, oops, there's Aronson on the right. So he wrote in the Jewish newspaper, now that Minneapolitans know the facts, what are they going to do about it? And then the Star-Journal also reprinted Aronson's response. So conveniently, McWilliams arrived in Minneapolis on November 7th, just a week later. He was the featured speaker at the U of M's weekly convocation. They used to have convocations weekly at Northrop Auditorium, no longer. And then he went the next day to Carleton College, where they still do have convocations, I know. His topic was racial minorities in America. So Carey McWilliams, about his claim in Common Ground, he said, this is in his talk at Northrop, I purposefully made that charge to bring the situation into the open in Minneapolis. He went on to say, most importantly, Minneapolis's situation is tied in with the whole national picture. Minneapolis is not to be considered alone, nor can anti-Semitism be considered apart from other tensions. So in 1945, Hubert Humphrey had been elected mayor of Minneapolis on a reform platform aimed at cleaning up municipal corruption, among other things. The article gave fresh impetus to the then floundering Mayor's Council on Human Relations that Humphrey had established. And if it's okay, I found this out from an upcoming book that's coming out about Humphrey's early years, written by Sam Friedman, who, thank you for coming, is in the back of the room. In my article, I noted that Humphrey established this council as a result of the article, but I reread and it was already there. So Humphrey asked McWilliams to confer with him and the group. The council conducted what came to be known later as the mayor's self-study, designed to assess communal opinions on various racial and religious groups. As McWilliams put it, the self-study would allow every part of the city to see itself in the mirror, so to speak. That reflection, which was released in 1948, was not pretty. It showed widespread exclusion of Jews, Blacks, Japanese Americans in employment, housing, and social life. The mayor's self-study led to joint efforts by the Urban League, the NAACP, the League of Women Voters, and the Minneapolis Jewish Council, which is the predecessor to our co-sponsor, the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, to work for local and statewide anti-discrimination legislation. And it's a much more complex picture than that. And in what, next spring, you said?
July 2023.
In the July of 2023, you will be able to read it in depth. And I urge you to check it out because I've had the chance to read it. McWilliams returned to the Twin Cities in the opening talk, to deliver the opening talk in the 1947-48 lecture series at the Jewish Education Center in St. Paul, which is the predecessor of today's St. Paul JCC. This time his topic was organized racism, a threat to democracy. So the year after Curious Twin, he hailed the amazing improvement in a year's time in interracial feeling in the Twin Cities, the result of a media campaign conducted by local organizations. Looking back at the impact of Curious Twin in his 1978 memoir, McWilliams noted, I was also intrigued by the fact that the non-Jewish majority in both cities seemed actually surprised and to a degree embarrassed when I called attention to the prevailing pattern of anti-Semitism. Beyond the mayor's counsel and self-study, Carey's article had wider ramifications. E.W. Zebarth, a dean here at the U of M, later wrote to McWilliams to say that the article had prompted CBS to launch an award-winning radio series, Neither Free Nor Equal. In a remarkably short period of time after the article appeared, nearly every exclusionary discrimination in the Twin Cities was lifted, McWilliams claimed. I guess it's important to say that, as my elder historian mentors have pointed out who lived through this, that it may have been overt, but it was still very much the case covertly. In 1975, a magazine called MPLS that had a special issue devoted to the present status of Jews in Minneapolis and St. Paul also said that anti-Semitism is no longer a problem in Minneapolis. So, as influential as McWilliams' article was, counter-narratives to the notion of Minneapolis being the leading hotbed of American anti-Semitism can be found in contemporary accounts and subsequent scholarship, including by McWilliams himself. So this is the article that Aronson wrote in response. He was invited by this national publication to write a response in 1947. And you can't read the, it's in a huge bound volume, so I had a really trouble photocopying it. So the headline reads, service, or the subhead, service clubs bar Jews, but extent of other anti-Semitism is normal, and author sees basis for progress. Okay. So he said, Aronson writes, is Minneapolis really an anti-Semitic Sodom? Do Jews walk around there whispering in terror? And do they look into closets and under their beds at night? Aronson said no. Quite definitively, the Jews of Minneapolis do not feel themselves as excluded as an outsider reading McWilliams might conclude. So then Aronson goes on to respond to every one of those findings that I mentioned earlier. And, he said, yeah, it's true. Jews aren't employed in major industries, but that doesn't mean that they were a depressed or oppressed group. They developed under other industries and represented a fairly comfortable middle class. And then he really discounted the whole social club thing. And he said, oh, it's demoralizing, but their importance of these clubs could be recorded on the back of a postage stamp. And he kept talking about people glad handing each other and sticking their hands in each other's pockets. And that's what these social clubs were about. And so the other thing about the accommodations in resorts and social clubs, it's just documented everywhere that this was happening all over the country, not just here. And Aronson points that out, and other people have too. So he also discounted the disdain of the evangelicals, fundamentalists, and Lutherans as saying it wasn't just directed against Jews exclusively, and that it was just part of the general atmosphere of parochialism and isolation in this area. Gotta agree with him there, but local politicians naturally resented the smearing of the city, he wrote, which led to considerable ferment and a variety of hopeful developments. So hopeful. Okay, another response was in this book that came out in 1948. It was a sociological examination of the Minneapolis Jewish community. There's a copy over there too. And it was written by a rabbi, Albert Gordon, who was getting his PhD in sociology at the U of M. By the time the book came out, he had already moved on, but he had been rabbi of Adath Jeshurun in South Minneapolis for 16 years. So he noted the presence and influence of the fundamentalist movement in Minneapolis's many Lutherans. And he said, like many others have and still say, that the responsibility for the city's anti-Semitism lay with the descendants of the New Englanders who still set the patterns for the community. Gordon also noted hopeful developments, but he said that anti-Semitism did continue to take a direct toll on the larger Jewish community who see an anti-Semite under every bed. They have the jitters. So, yeah. Aronson did not feel that in general, Minneapolis was radically different from St. Paul. In 1959, Gunter Plaut, who I will show you in a moment, who was rabbi at St. Paul's Mount Zion Temple, that very first synagogue in Minnesota, Plaut wrote, it would be erroneous to assume that while, come back. Yeah. But I wanted to actually kind of hit there for a sec. I'm going to go back and forth. So there's Plaut's book. There's Plaut sitting down. And Plaut says it would be quite erroneous to assume that while Minneapolis Jews were battering against the inroads of prejudice, St. Paul Jews were enjoying a bonanza of complete acceptance. Nothing could be further from the truth. Plaut admitted, however, that though far from ideal, there was a general feeling that St. Paul was better off. And then Plaut noted that at the same time that McWilliams came to his journalistic conclusions back in 1946, remember Plaut's rating 10 years later, 12 years later, Charles I. Cooper, executive secretary of the Jewish Family Welfare Agency, came to quite a different conclusion. And the name of the article he wrote is on the slide. And Cooper said the Minneapolis general community is basically no more antagonistic to local Jews than other similar communities. There is nothing to indicate that the Jewish community of Minneapolis today needs to be stamped as more unacceptable socially than and inferior to other Jewish communities in the Middle West. Following on the heels of Curious Twin, in 1948, McWilliams published A Mask for Privilege. In it, he attempted to trace the pattern of American anti-Semitism and examine the nature of the disease and how it can be combated. As the title suggests, he concludes that Jewish exclusion was the result of privileged groups manufacturing a system of screens to mask their attempted monopoly of social, economic, and political power. Where 2 years earlier, he found that Minneapolis was, as far as he knew, the only city in America where Jews were not accepted into service clubs, now he proclaims the pattern of social discrimination against Jews in the United States is well nigh universal. Critics and McWilliams himself did not consider A Mask for Privilege to be one of his strongest books. So one final reaction. In 1946, McWilliams saw distinctiveness, a decade later, sociologists Judith K. Kramer and Seymour Lementman selected Minneapolis as their research subject, because it was both accessible and reasonably representative of the minority situation of 3 generations since immigration of American Jews. So again, here we have this guy, these other researchers saying, this is a representative community. It isn't a distinctive community. We're going to use it as our research subject. And Marilyn Chiat, who again, she was actually interviewed, she and her husband, for this study back in the late 50s, right? It came out a couple of years later. So the authors noted the striking resemblance that this community bears to older and larger Jewish communities, and note that yes, it had special properties, which included that virulent tradition of discrimination in employment, which has influenced even members of the younger generation to work for themselves. Nevertheless, they have no cause for complaint. Being Jewish is no longer an economic problem to the 3rd generation. Now, I'm not going to be able to tell you all about what happened to Carey McWilliams because we're kind of running out of time, but here he is in his later years, and here are those 9 books he wrote in just an 11-year period. I got to say, though, that one of his books about Southern California was the basis for the screenplay for Chinatown that Robert Towne wrote. So again, this man has, what do you mean no? Okay, you can argue that with Richardson. Okay. No, we'll get to it offline, okay? So, conclusion. Why does this matter? Lessons learned. Residing in the geographically isolated upper Midwest, Minneapolis Jews were well aware that their particular situation was unfavorable until an influential journalist like Carey McWilliams illuminated it to a national audience. However, the community at large was happy to let discrimination and prejudice towards Jews and other minorities remain the status quo. The dirty laundry, aired by Curious Twin, by McWilliams' own description, impressions based upon jotted down notes and a few interviews, fortuitously coincided with Hubert Humphrey's mayoral administration and a cadre of community leaders willing to take ameliorative measures, which was undeniably good. Though anti-Semitism was a significant concern, it was by no means a major one in McWilliams' long and prolific career. Minneapolis may have been St. Paul's Curious Twin, but could it be possible that claiming Minneapolis was the capital of American anti-Semitism was a canny move made by a seasoned journalist engaging in the kind of barbed style he was known for in his earlier career? To say Minneapolis is the capital of anti-Semitism in the United States made and makes for a quotable meme, but after 75 years, perhaps it is time to change the definite article "the" to the indefinite "a." So just a couple of why does this matter? I just want to advocate for continuing to reassess sacred cows, and this is in the field of Jewish history, such as the Curious Twin. I also learned during the research of this that when I consulted, Gordon and Plout, I found errors and things that aren't substantiated by facts or sources. And the fact that there's always more to be found on this topic, like on Friday when Kate and I were here filling the vitrine and she's on a research leave and she found a folder that I'd never seen called Carey McWilliams. And in it, there's 2 items in there. And one is like a letter from the National Anti-Defamation League writing to the local guy, Sam Shiner, saying, "Is this true?" And another one is a telegram from Carey McWilliams himself to the Minneapolis Star saying, "I understand you're going to reprint my article. I have some more edits." Like, and some of them are equivocations. Check it out. And my final point is just in general, that just a plea to broaden the topics that we look at in Minnesota Jewish history. Avoid triumphalist history. By all means, keep looking at Kid Can and why Jews moved to St. Louis Park. But there is so much more. Jewish socialists and communists, the Labor Lyceum, women and working class Jews, and building on Linda Schloff's work on Greater Minnesota. Is Alan Slachter here? He was going to come, but he has done some research on a Jewish enclave in Pine City at the time of the forest fires. That's an example. So there's so much more. So that is my conclusion, and thank you very much for listening. And questions next.
Right. It looks like we've got about 5 minutes for questions. We have a few online, but we can start in the room if anyone has a question. Right here.
I have a mic, so the folks online hear your question.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for this talk. It was a great talk, very, very interesting and informative and fun in a way, even though the topic isn't fun. I wanted to first just a historical question about Minneapolis. Isn't it true that soon after Humphrey there was a Jewish mayor of Minneapolis?
Well, it was about a decade later. It was Arthur Napthalen,
Right.
And now we have a Jewish mayor again, Jacob Fry. So when was Napthalen elected? In the 60s, the early 60s.
So it took a while. And then this is just an observation about the period when McWilliams was writing about Jewish fascism. To the extent that he was involved in leftist politics in the 1930s, that was a kind of commonplace on the left, especially the communist left, that fascism was only, fascism and capitalism were equivalent, that there was almost no difference between them, that fascism was only the latest version of capitalism. And it's a view that became harder and harder to uphold as the war got worse, and obviously the knowledge of what happened during the Holocaust.
Yeah, he, again, this is part of his background that is so great, but yeah, what you say is true. I think maybe we should just move to a next question. Yeah.
Ellen, do you want to one from online?
Yes, there are also thanks and well done coming in online. So, but the first question that came in at the start of your lecture, you mentioned several Midwestern cities. Did Minneapolis have the most anti-Semitism, or were other cities, especially Detroit, close behind?
I haven't done a comparative study of cities, and oh wait, I'm supposed to repeat the question. Was Minneapolis?
She's got there.
Oh, okay. All right. I didn't do a comparative study. That would be a great thing to do in the future. I'm assuming yes. Detroit, I don't know for sure, but I listened to a talk this summer about Madison, Wisconsin, and he had the same kind of things to say. But every city has its own unique history, and that history impacts on how that affects the Jewish citizens. Yeah.
Any other questions in the room? Otherwise, we have a few more online.
The next question online, could you comment on two interesting chapters in this saga? Number one, the fascinating story of the history of North Minneapolis, and two, the role of Charles Lindbergh in local Minneapolis anti-Semitism. Thank you.
North Minneapolis. There's so much out there about it. I'd be happy to provide a bibliography. Tomorrow at noon at St. Thomas, there's going to be a talk by Marilyn Scheidt and Jean Kildee where they're going to talk about the some churches in North Minneapolis. And then Lindbergh, again, lots of research on that. And I would just say, check out Ken Burns' America and the Holocaust at this point. But yeah, it's a very well-known phenomenon that he had very isolationist views and said some anti-Semitic things and accepted a award from Hitler, before the war, but then he changed his tune and became a pilot, in the US Army.
Yeah, I'll be right with you.
David Harris.
So you pointed out very early on that the author's conclusions were based on impressions and very, very limited sources. When we talk about Jews, of course, there's great variety within the Jewish community, economically, culturally. Is it possible to say anything about the different experiences of the different segments of the Jewish community in that period of time to this anti-Semitism that's being talked about?
I looked at economic discrimination in depth, and some Jewish families who came early, their families established businesses, and then their sons and grandsons worked in those businesses, and perhaps they were less affected economically. But if you were looking for a job and had to be employed somewhere, it was very difficult. And I looked at this, the Jewish community set up something called the Jewish Free Employment Bureau, and there's ads in the Jewish world all through the 30s where, people with professions like bookkeeper or stenographer or lower level working class kind of jobs needed jobs. So, there was definite class differences in the Jewish community, wealthier, less wealthy neighborhoods. That's part of that whole history. If you're going to look at the history of North Minneapolis, which neighborhoods had which socioeconomic groups. So I guess I would say that is where it was the most prevalent and noticeable. And then, everybody was discriminated against, I suppose, about the social clubs. I hope that answers a little. It's a big question. Yes. Please.
So one thing I find really interesting is the differences between different waves of immigration. And so that first wave of German Jews came with capital, they came with money. And then you see the second wave coming, and that's Eastern European Jews. And for the average kind of, St. Paul person, they're like, well, they're Jewish too, go help them. And German Jews are like, we have a totally different culture, a different language, a different understanding of life. Just because we're Jewish, we are not the same. And so you see different kind of jobs. That's how we see a vast proliferation of synagogues, because they have different ways of observing their faith. And then, all that kind of economic differences. So when you look at waves of immigration and the ways that their lives are different over those waves is really interesting. I think we have time for one more question online.
The last question online is, I heard that Minneapolis Jews could not belong to AAA because they owned a country club.
That's what I made that point, I hope, in the talk.
So to confirm, the answer is yes.
Yes. I mean, so they discriminated against them at the country club.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jews set up their own country clubs, which people like my parents didn't belong to, because again, talk about the different stratas, okay?
Which is a perfect tie-in to here in Archives and Special Collections, we have a First Fridays lecture series. And this year the theme is It's All Fun and Games. And in May, I will be giving a presentation about Jewish country clubs. So there's flyers in the back. Perfect. So there's flyers in the back if you're interested in that. So thank you once again to Laura. We very much appreciate you, and thank you everyone for coming.